when they asked me to come, there were many reasons I said yes, and one of them was that Dan would be here, and there's really no one whose thoughts on all these questions I value much more. And one of them was I knew I'd see all kinds of friends, and one of them was that I liked the title, The Ecologies of Human Flourishing. Is a beautiful notion. And one of the chief among them was just the chance to see and be able to pay some tribute to Don, who's I first met a very long time ago when I was a very young writer in my 20s and had just published The End of Nature and was asked to go off, for reasons I'm not clear how I sort of got asked, but to Thailand to give a talk to sort of ecologists and Buddhists in Thailand. And we were in Chiang Mai, near Chiang Mai, and I hadn't given very many talks, and I was giving a talk, and it was at night, and we were outdoors. And there was a bright white light shining on me, and I was wearing a white shirt. And as a result, I was a sort of magnet for the most unbelievable assortment of large insects that kept appearing and landing on me. And I mean, things the size of, moths the size of, red-tailed hawks and things would sort of appear. And I for whatever reason, I would sort of carefully lift them off. I don't remember anything I said that night, but I remember Don came up to me afterward and said, well, you did a good job, because those were all Buddhists watching, and if you had just swatted them away, they wouldn't have listened to a thing you said. So I was always grateful for that, and I've remembered it. What little I know about public speaking. This question of how we're going to flourish is such a nice way to put it. Another way to put it, a more direct way, one that sort of people ask me all the time, is what can we do now? What can we do about the situation that we're in? What can we do is a question that we've hardly even considered for the last 300 or 400 years, because the answer to it has always been implicit. We can do anything we want, as much of it as we can think of. And so what we've done is an awful lot. We've gone to the moon. More incredibly, we've learned how at least the top 20 or 30% of the world to fly each other around the planet again and again and again, and on the most flimsy of reasons, just appearing hither and yon as if by magic. We've built enormous homes and built enormous vehicles to drive us in between them. There's been very little that we couldn't do, and the reason for that is because we've had in that period access to cheap fossil fuel. That's been the single most important feature of modern life. It's what we call modern life. Every action of that life is intimately tied to the combustion of that fossil fuel 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in at least the wealthy parts of the world. That's now ending. It's going to end for two reasons. One, we're starting to run short of this magic stuff that we've been using for several centuries. We don't know exactly how short we're going to run or how exactly it'll manifest itself, but the people who talk about the peak oil phenomenon are, in the largest sense, I think, correct. We can see the beginning of the end of access to endless cheap supplies of fossil fuel. Even more important, we're running up against deep physical limits, mostly in the ability of the atmosphere to cope with the byproducts of burning all that fossil fuel. And the gradual accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere has now begun inexorably the process of heating the planet with really dramatic effect. This isn't a kind of new notion. Atmospheric chemists and physicists have worried about it for more than a century. Arrhenius, the great Swedish chemist, the first to do so before the turn of the last century. But we never really knew when the problem would manifest in the deepest ways. Not until the 1980s, when we began to have computer models sufficiently powerful enough to really give us some sense. And really, even then, not until the last decade when we began to see with our own eyes the unmistakable effects of that kind of change. The fact that sea ice across the Arctic melted so spectacularly in the summer of 2007. The fact that people in Dan's line of work have now made it very clear that we're rapidly acidifying the planet's oceans, something that we really even hadn't considered as a possibility until fairly recently. On and on and on. I could obviously elaborate for a very long time on the facts of climate change and what we're seeing. I'm not going to bother to do that. I think there's no real need. Suffice it to say that we have a rough sense of what those limits are. In January of 2008, our foremost climatologist on this planet, Jim Hansen at NASA, and his team published a paper saying that in the roughest possible terms, 350 parts per million CO2 was as much as we better let out in the atmosphere. In fact, the way they put it in the abstract of that journal article, and this is pretty strong language for a scientific journal, is any value for carbon in the atmosphere greater than 350 parts per million is not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. Strong language. Stronger language when you know that we're well past that already at 390 parts per million and rising steadily. These 350 represents no exact cutoff. It represents the obvious fact now that we've already gone past the place where we should be. That wherever the proper limit it's behind us now, and we need to work with much greater urgency than we have in the past to finally even begin to address these problems. Given those limits, it strikes me that a new logic prevails if we're going to talk about human flourishing, and that our sense of what we need and want out of the world will change with it. That the constant emphasis on endless growth and expansion of economies will begin to seem less desirable and less important, and that a different set of goals and aspirations will become more powerful. That security and stability will seem more and more attractive to us as opposed to growth, especially in those parts of the world that have already made it. That have already reached some level of affluence necessary to support dignified lives. It's a much more excruciating problem in those parts of the world that have not yet done so. But I think in general that all the kind of glory associated with concept of growth will begin to tarnish, and that instead words like stability, concepts like hunkering down, will become more and more and more the kind of lingo that we adopt, that maturity will become our credo instead of growth. I think also that there's a kind of second logical and even more important development that will flow more or less naturally from the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel age. And that is that the constant tendency, the constant logic of cheap fossil fuel has been to centralize things, and that the logic of what comes next will be to disperse and localize them. Let's look at a few commodities just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. Our food system, for instance, is now essentially a centralized and industrial operation. Very few people producing the food that we eat on relatively limited acreage, and doing it with the help of almost unbelievable quantities of fossil fuel, between the production of fertilizer, between the traction necessary to till the fields, between the transport of the food once it's harvested. These are enough to ensure that the food you eat is essentially marinated in crude oil before it reaches your lips. That's not a system, I think, that will last, and I think you can already begin to see it breaking down and begin to sense what comes after it. Local farmers markets have been the fastest growing part of the American food economy for the last decade, with sales doubling and doubling again. That's very interesting to see. And there are places now where it's gone beyond a kind of small part of the food system to become a major, if not the major part of it. I don't know if people here have had the pleasure of being in Madison, Wisconsin on a Saturday when their amazing farmers market draws often 100,000 people to the streets around the Capitol. That's been enough to fundamentally rewrite the agricultural economics of that part of the state and change the value of land and the way that it's used. And we're beginning to see that around the country. The last agricultural census, last 5-year agricultural census in this country showed a pretty remarkable increase in the number of farms. For the first time in about 125 years, farms, instead of constantly declining, the number of farms was on the uptick. Most of them in this category of small farms growing food for people to eat locally. Think about energy itself, the second most important commodity in our lives. Energy, under the old model, made great sense to have a few huge centralized power plants, say. There's about 500 or 600 scattered around the U.S. that provide almost all the electricity that we use, and the majority of electricity comes from burning coal in order to produce that electricity. If we begin to move away from those fossil fuels, which were magnificent mostly because they were concentrated, rich in BTUs, and easy to transport, and begin to rely instead on renewable energy, a whole different set of logical paradigms operate. Sun and wind are widely dispersed. They're available everywhere, but they're available in not as large and concentrated a quantity. That is, I have solar panels on my rooftop. Okay, on a sunny day, I'm a utility. I'm firing electrons down the grid. And one can imagine and begin to see in operation a grid that looks more like a farmer's market in energy than the centralized model we have at the moment. Now, you can take that farther than it's need to take it. There are still remain concentrated pockets of good wind and intense sun on this continent and others that will exploit more than other places. But in essence, one begins to see a multinodal energy system, what the engineers call distributed generation, as the replacement for the very centralized systems that we have. More speculatively, but beginning to happen now, one begins to see maybe the third most important commodity on this planet, capital, beginning to, at least you can begin to understand why you might want to disperse it in some of those ways. The astonishing failure of one big money center bank or investment house after another 2 years ago that came very close to bringing the world's economy down with it was a reminder that things that are too big to fail shouldn't be allowed to be that big. It's not that they shouldn't be, we should figure out some way to keep them from failing. It's that we should keep them from getting big enough that their failure is a problem. And just in the same, if you look around the country, most small banks, at least at first before the ripple effects of the recession caused by those big banks' failures began to work its way down, did okay. In places where people knew who they were lending to and what that meant and whatever, we've had many fewer problems. That decreased vulnerability of systems in general, I think, is one of the things that will be very nice about the world that comes after. Take, for instance, that solar panel on my roof. Theoretically, some terrorist could take an interest in it and climb up on my roof and destroy it, take a hammer to it, But if he did, the only person who'd really be damaged would be me, and there would be no sort of deadly solar particles, floating out into the atmosphere. The same thing happens in an economy built on small banks. The unwise decisions at First Middlebury Bank might be enough to cause it and its shareholders problems, but they're not enough to cause any problem upstream. the way that the failure of Lehman or AIG or whatever clearly did. It's very good, therefore, to see experiments in new ways of distributing capital. One of the most interesting in the country that I've just done some writing about in the western part of this state, where there are now about 3 million Berkshires in circulation, an alternative complementary currency that one can get at regular FDIC chartered banks. You can cash your paycheck in US dollars and or in Berkshires. And the way that that money recirculates in the local economy is powerful to see. Those kind of experiments are very useful and good, and I think we'll see more of them. And I think that as this happens, and this gets to the title of this series, as this happens, the possibility for human flourishing is very much there in a way that maybe it hasn't been for the last 100 years or so, which, however else you make it out, hasn't, I think, been the greatest epic, at least in this country, for that kind of flourishing. The biggest impact on our lives of fossil fuel, I would argue, has been in a way to make us lonelier people than we were before. By allowing us, encouraging us to do a series of things that weren't possible without access to that cheap fossil fuel, we've fallen into a number of traps. If you think about what the American economy has mostly done since the end of World War II, by far the biggest part of its vigor has been spent on the project of building bigger homes farther apart from each other. Okay? A process that perhaps has now reached its zenith with the collapse of the housing market in the wake of this last recession. But not only did that project require immense amounts of energy to build and heat and light and cool these homes and drive between them, it also, I think, had profound effects on who we were. The average American in 1950 ate twice as many meals with friends and family and neighbors as the average American at the moment. The average American in 1950 had twice as many friends, close friends, as the average American now. Those are enormous changes. Now, there are many explanations for what went on, and television clearly has played a role, and on and on and on. But simply the mathematical process of isolating ourselves in ever larger buildings, ever further apart from each other, has played an enormous role in these deep, deep changes. Human satisfaction in this country, the number of Americans who say they're very satisfied with their lives, peaked sometime in the mid-1950s and has been slowly declining ever since, even as our standard of living has almost trebled over that period of time. Something's not allowing us to flourish. And my guess is that there are things implicit in this new world that we're coming to that will be more useful for that purpose. I'll give you just one statistic that I like. Farmers markets, which I already said were the fastest growing part of our food economy. That's because people want good food and so on and so forth. But the real reason, I think, is because they want the contact that those places provide. A pair of sociologists several years ago followed shoppers, first around the supermarket, then around the farmers market. You all have been to the supermarket. You know how it works. You walk in, you fall into a light fluorescent trance, you visit the Stations of the Cross around the supermarket, you emerge somehow with the same basket of goods you had the week before. That's about it. When they followed shoppers around the farmers market, they found that they were having, on average, 10 times more conversations per visit. Okay? Beginning to re-knit some of that lost sense of community that is at the root of much of the lack of flourishing around us. That's, to my mind, the good news. The bad news is that even as we localize, we still have a series of acute global problems that we somehow have to deal with, climate change being the most important of all. And so now I'm going to switch from conjecture about things to just telling you a few stories about how I've spent the last few years of my life, because actually it's involved very little intellectual effort and a great deal of sort of organizing effort, trying to figure out how to build a movement finally to do something, put some pressure on about climate change in a way that there had not been either nationally or internationally. Because, among other things, we have to figure out we can't deal with this problem of climate one community at a time. It's simply do not have the time, and the scale is too large. We have to figure out how to globally and nationally put a price on carbon, take effective action to cap its production. That's a political task above all, and there's no way around that. When we started trying to figure out how to build a movement, and I had no experience doing any of this and no idea what I was doing in the fall of 2006 when we started. In fact, the very first thing we did was I had just come back from a kind of heart-wrenching trip to Bangladesh, and I've got to do something. I don't know how to do anything. I'm a writer. I live in the woods. What am I going to do? I called up some of my friends, other writers in Vermont, said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to Burlington, which is our main city, and we're going to sit in on the steps of the federal building, and we'll be arrested, and there'll be a little story in the paper, and at least we will have done something. And the writers, oh, that's an excellent plan. Let's do that. And except that somebody was smart enough to call the police in Burlington, ask what would happen. The police said, well, nothing will happen. Stay there as long as you want, you know. And so we called off that plan and instead did this march across Vermont, and we had, by the time we were done, there's a few people in this room who were there. By the time we were done, we had about 1,000 people, which in Vermont, I mean, you all are sophisticated Bay Staters, but in Vermont, 1,000 people is, I mean, except for UVM hockey games, that's as many people as ever assemble for any purpose. And we got all our legislators come down to meet with us, and it was great. They all not only met with us, they signed this thing that they're going to work to cut carbon emissions 80% by 20. Not just the Democrats, you know, the woman who almost won the GOP congressional, won our congressional seat that year, Republican, who had said 2 months before, she'd said, I'm not sure global warming is real. More research needs to be done. The more research that needed to be done was how many people will walk across Vermont and ask me to change my mind. And 1,000 was sufficient. It gave us some sense that movement building was what we needed to do, because we opened the paper the next morning and there was a story that said that 1,000 people may have been the biggest single demonstration about climate change that had yet taken place in the U.S. Well, no wonder we're losing. We have the brightest minds in the country, people like Dan, hard at work in Washington and elsewhere with all the policies that we need. The trouble is they have nothing behind them. Okay? And every senator can read a naked bluff in this, hand of cards. They know if there's no reason to pay attention to what's going on. And so we needed to build that. First, we did this thing around this country called Step It Up. And in the course of a few months with a few college students, we coordinated 1,400 rallies around the U.S. in the spring of 2007. And that was good because it got Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton to buy into this 80% cuts in carbon emissions, which was way more than they'd ever talked about before. That was fun. But it clearly wasn't enough. A few weeks later, the Arctic started to melt. Clearly, we're going to need to work on a planetary scale. So we decided to see somewhat ludicrously if we could do that too, if we could organize on a global scale. And we took this number 350 as the kind of starting point, mostly, for two reasons. One, it at least attempted to set some kind of actual target so our leaders couldn't get away with just saying, we're taking action on climate change. And second, because the biggest problem for global organizing is everybody around the world insists on speaking their own language, Not just having their own religion, but speaking their own language. It makes it very difficult to communicate. Arabic numerals happily cross linguistic boundaries. So we set to work. And the reason I'm telling you this story is because I think it follows the same model as what I was talking about with food or energy or anything else. When we started organizing, old people who'd done this in the 60s said, what you have to do is have a march on Washington. That's how it's done. We said, we can't organize that. It's dumb to tell people to drive across America to protest global warming. And anyway, we now have this tool that will allow us to do things on a dispersed basis and make them add up to more than the sum of their parts. And we kind of beta tested it in the United States, and then we decided to see if we could do it on a global scale. We had 7 23-year-olds. That was the crew. And me, a sort of rapidly aging writer. 7 was a good number. There are 7 continents. Each one of them took one. The guy who got Antarctica also took the internet because it's its own continent, you know. And off they set. This was 18 months ago. And they began organizing. And our goal was to take this number and push it into the middle of this debate, to sharpen the science of this debate. So we picked a date, October 24th of last fall. So we're going to do this all over the world on this day, figure out. Well, we didn't know what would happen. We organized like heck, and we had found great people everywhere. Still, a major challenge. We gathered in New York a few days before, our core crew, to kind of do the final push, you know, and basically to sit by our computers and wait, because we told everybody to upload images as soon as their rallies and things took place. And I'll show you a couple of slides now just to give you some sense. I'll cut to the chase. The thing worked, okay, at least on its own terms. There were 5,200 rallies in 181 countries. It was, CNN said, the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history. Foreign Policy just did a piece a couple of weeks ago saying the largest ever coordinated global rally of any kind. We got a sense it was going to start working a couple of days early. And I'll just tell you this story to give you some sense of how we organized. We got a call from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia from an 18-year-old girl. We trained her and her sister, her 19-year-old sister, at a little climate camp we did in South Africa. And sort of trained, and then they'd gone back to Ethiopia. People scattered, young people back all over the continent. We didn't hear much from them because the internet doesn't work very well in much of Africa. We got this call on Thursday, and Aliyah saying, well, it's going really good. We've got 15,000 people demonstrating in the streets of Addis Ababa for 350. And we were like, well, that's really good. And she said, the only problem is we can't get you a picture because the internet's down again. No, because we really need this picture to show to AP and Reuters so we can get coverage. We finally found the one hotel in Addis with the sort of where all the development people go, kind of Western hotel. And we sent the first 2 people that they sent in got kicked out because they were black, but finally we found a white person, and they went in and sat at the bar and ordered a drink and pushed the button. And you know, a few minutes later we had pictures from Addis, and a few minutes after that they were up all over the world. And after that they just started to pour in. A couple of minutes later, these American soldiers in Afghanistan sent us this 350 they made with sandbags that were parking our Humvee for the weekend. Then the day just sort of started unfolding. The lights, please. Yeah, maybe there's a way to get those lights out. I'll move this chair. And then it just sort of rolling around the world. And some of them are so beautiful that it was, you know, just hard to look at them without breaking into tears. Mostly, and this is the point I want to make, okay, if you've been told at some point in your life that environmentalists are rich white people, pay attention to these pictures. Most of them are of poor, brown, black, Asian, and young people because that's what the world is mostly composed of, all right? And they are every bit as interested and concerned, and in many cases more so, because they're dealing right now with already the effects of what we're seeing. We had 300 big demonstrations across India organized by young people. So I didn't know where that is. I thought it was appropriate for Don to show that mountain someplace, sacred mountain somewhere. And some of them came. These guys didn't have a digital camera. They took these are dugout canoes on the Congo River, someplace near Kinshasa. They took a picture. It didn't come out so well, so they wrote what was on their banner on the thing, and then they figured found someone who could scan it in and send it to us. But someplace on the Congo River, someone had gotten this same T-shirt that I'm wearing and the same message. Just place after place, we had a lot of big underwater demonstrations. Istanbul had the worst flooding in its history 6 weeks before. There were huge gatherings there. A lot of public art. That's from the Space Needle in Seattle. That's the colors of the Venezuelan flag. I like that picture of Tahiti. That's an operating room in Puerto Rico. Hopefully they didn't stop for too long. Those are lantern dancers in Australia. This picture I wanted to show today because one of the things that really worked was a deep involvement of religious communities for the first time in this kind of work. This is the head of Muslim South Africa. This guy is I don't know what his title is, but he's a prominent representative of sort of native religion in South Africa. And that's Desmond Tutu's successor as Archbishop, Anglican Archbishop in the crimson behind them there. They led this big march through Cape Town. That's a Pentecostal school someplace in Ghana. The perfect example of environmental foundation. Wheaton College, where Billy Graham went to school, and where even a few years ago there would not have been an environmental demonstration, and now there was, something that made me very pleased. I'm kind of keeping all of you from seeing it there, aren't I? So I can move this a little bit.
That's not bad. You just unplugged.
It's all right. It's just a power cord thing. I've been to Bethlehem a few weeks before trying to organize. Not an easy place to get to, and not an easy place to organize. But everybody there says, we want to really work on this. The Dead Sea is shrinking. In Jordan, we'll make the 3. In Palestine, we'll make the 5. In Israel, the 0. And we'll make the point that you got to work across borders. We did a lot of that kind of big Scrabble. That's from the top of the Red Fort in Delhi. That's Sydney. That's under the London Eye. That's in Copenhagen. Any place where we could find iconic locations. So in India, but in the U.S., it was an autumn weekend, so there's Syracuse football field and the cheerleaders, doing their thing. That's the sandbags in Boston Harbor. You have a beautiful picture of Concord. Just on and on and on. Those are across Africa. Birders got together to find 350 species that weekend. Bhopal, the scene of the greatest environmental crime of the last century. It just moved me to see people still willing to kind of engage with the rest of the world, even. Lots and lots of climbers. That's in Table Mountain in South Africa. I show you this just so you can get a sense of scale. That's the same banner in Soweto, headquarters of resistance to lots of things. They did 350 bungee jumps, but the reason that I show you the picture is they strung the bungee cord between 2 cooling towers from a defunct coal-fired power plant. This is the use to which we need to put coal-fired power plants in the future. That's one of my students in Middlebury had a time-lapse camera. Sap buckets in Vermont. We had 300 big demonstrations across China. Only 1 got broken up by the police. The rest, the young people we were working with, were savvy enough to figure out how to sort of walk up to the line and not cross it. Those are youth in the China Youth Climate Network in Inner Mongolia making a human wind turbine, and behind them you can see the world's largest turbine field. Lots of groups helped us all over the place, lots of places that you wouldn't expect. That woman started out that day with a big crowd of people, but they had to go through 6 U.S. Army checkpoints to get to the site of the old Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and she was the only one with the guts enough to keep going all the way through. That's one of my very favorite pictures. Honduras was under military curfew. It didn't matter. They had a big demonstration. In the Maldives, those are youth holding a meeting. The president of the Maldives, Mohammed Nasheed, trained his whole cabinet in scuba diving. They went underwater to pass a 350 resolution against the backdrop of their dying coral reef that day. People on a stump in Tasmania, beautiful art and all over the place. We didn't use celebrities. Numbers and scientists were the closest thing we had to celebrities because we wanted to avoid. We didn't think we needed to, that people would get this on their own, and they did. But we did take over Times Square for the day and take all those big jumbotrons that are usually used for vodka ads and things, and instead had these pictures. And people all around the world, I told them we were going to do this, and they got very excited. Put my picture in Times Square. So we did our best. We got amazing press coverage. We owned the Google News page for about 36 hours, and it was on the front page of almost all the papers. The point is that there were lots and lots and lots of places where people would say you shouldn't be able to organize. The 0 there, we had a whole file of pictures made up of women in burqas, Our stereotype is that these are not people who would be doing this kind of thing, but of course they care just as much about what their children's future looks like as anybody else. The oil sheikdom of Abu Dhabi, but they've begun to realize they'll run out of oil someday. Hence, they also have the world's largest solar array behind them there. places I'd never heard of. We had a whole file that was just marked by the end of the weekend 350 adorable, with lots and lots of pictures. That girl in the middle just kills me every time. The Maldives, I mean, she's unlikely to be able to live in her country when she's full grown. The odds of the Maldives being a habitable place seem low. Those kids had all been born in the same day in August, and so their parents got back together. They'd met in the maternity ward, and they got back together for a kind of party to try to help their future. And from the sublime to the ridiculous, those are electric golf carts in Laguna Woods. Mostly poor people all over the world. People who spent the day cleaning up a very poor part of a very poor city. An orphanage in Indonesia where they spent the day doing a bottle pickup thing. They wrote us a note in broken English. It said, even though no one caring about us, we caring about the earth. Bangladesh, okay, nobody got the day off in Bangladesh, which is where most of the world's T-shirts are made, but they stopped work long enough to do their kind of thing all over the country, and indeed they made a bunch of T-shirts, which is they do. I've shown you all these pictures. I could show you many more because there are 25,000 of them in our Flickr account. I won't. I'll just say all of this was really great, but it didn't carry the day. Not yet. We got to Copenhagen 6 weeks later. We managed to convince 117 of the world's nations to endorse this 350 target, which was unbelievable, way beyond our wildest imaginings. But they were the wrong 117. They were the poor countries and the vulnerable ones. The rich, powerful, and deeply fossil fuel addicted ones weren't ready to commit to anything at all at the conference, much less anything that would have accomplished very much. And they remain in that posture at the moment. Our country probably chief among them. There are more signs other places, I think, like China, of real engagement with this process than there is in the U.S. Senate at the moment. Maybe we'll see something happen in the next few weeks once we get through health care, but we're not going to count on that. Our plan for this year that we need your help with is to continue this kind of organizing around the world. The date I want you to circle on your calendar and I want you to spread word about to everyone is October 10th. That day we're going to have not a kind of global political rally like we did, but a global work party all over the world. And in thousands of places people were putting up solar panels, laying out bike paths, digging community gardens, doing all those kind of things. Not in the belief that we can solve this problem one project at a time. We can't. The momentum is too strong, the world too large. But they'll help. More to the point, they'll help us make the point to our leaders that if we can do this work, then they sure as hell can too. You know? That if we can get up on the roofs of schools and put up solar panels, then people in the Senate can do the work that they're paid to do, of writing legislation and passing it, you know? We need to begin shaming some of those leaders and pushing them much harder than they've been pushed to do something. We need that kind of movement. One of the best parts of this, since we're here in the Divinity School, has been the deep involvement of religious communities. Nobody knows better than John and Mary Evelyn that 10 or 15 years ago, there was no religious environmental movement. But now, in large part, thanks to them and others, there is. And it's really coming of age. On this day, thousands of churches rang their bells 350 times. We had all kinds of Buddhists around the world doing 350 minutes of meditation and people prostrating themselves, you know, all kinds of interesting stuff. And that will continue on as we go into this year. Building that kind of power. I'm not at all convinced that we're going to win. It's not at all clear that it's, you know, we haven't waited altogether too long to get started. But I am convinced that the same model that I talked about in terms of food and energy is the one that we're going to have to draw on in terms of politics. People doing things in all kinds of places and then figuring out how to connect them together through this new architecture of communication that we have to be bigger than the sum of their parts, to figure out how to put real political pressure on this system, because otherwise, at least at the moment, there's very little sign of the change that we need happening. The ground for human flourishing of any kind is a relatively stable planet. If we can't do this work, then all the other things that I've talked about local food and whatever else, won't in the end really happen. You can be the best organic gardener in the world, but it's got to rain sometime, you know. And unless we can do this work very, very quickly, then much else will be impossible. But if we do it right, and we do this kind of political work, then much else becomes possible in the course of it, not the least of which is the building of real, meaningful, and tight bonds between people around the world of very different circumstance and background and belief and class, and race, and everything else. It was unbelievably moving to be sitting in New York watching these images stream in across the computer for 36 hours. For once, I really felt like all those old cliches about how people are all the same under the skin and whatever really were true in some sense. And it was a quite beautiful thing. It's a pleasure to get to share a few of them with you and to ask you for your help in the months and years ahead. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Bill, very, very much for an informative and inspiring talk. Dan.
Wow. I love hearing Bill talk. Bill always reminds me of, makes me feel more hopeful. I've got to say, it's hard to be a climate scientist these days, especially this year. Watching the decline, fewer than 40% of the American public thinks that climate change is even happening, according to the recent Pew poll. In fact, I think only like 15% actually think it's actually serious. Those numbers are way down from last year, and the difference was the coal lobby spent about $300 million last year. People aren't actually aware of just how well organized and serious the interests are that are involved in this issue. But Bill gives us a lot of hope in terms of thinking about people around the world and the ability to motivate them, but also appealing to something that I think touches me in a particularly strong way, which has to do with human values. Values that we all share that climate scientists like myself are actually very uncomfortable talking about. Because we like to talk about observations, we get questioned. For example, IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is in its nature the most conservative body in the world. They're afraid to say anything unless it's broadly agreed upon by hundreds of scientists. And nothing can be talked about unless it's in the published literature. There's been a big hullabaloo, I don't know if people have heard about it, about the melting of glaciers up in the Himalayas. The problem is, and this is actually true all over the world, for example, in California, the Sierra Nevada, agriculture in California is in very big trouble because they depend on snow melt up in the mountains of the Sierra Nevada. That snow falls in the wintertime and melts throughout the summer. And by the end of the century, maybe even sooner, those rivers will run dry by the middle of the summer. And there's not enough space to build reservoirs to make up for the natural capacity of the mountains. This is actually true all over the West. This is a real problem. And the concern in the Himalayas and in the Tibetan Plateau is that these are rivers that essentially sustain agriculture for something like 3 billion people. This is a really big problem. There was a line in the IPCC report that somehow people missed that said that these glaciers would be gone by 2035. The truth is, we have no idea how long it's going to take to melt them. What it should have said was they might be gone by 2035. But as a result, there's an international investigation of the IPCC and the credibility because of this sentence out of 2,000 pages. Seriously, you can read all about it. So it is a tough time to be a climate scientist. I've got to say, though, when we think about values and the value of human flourishing, of simplicity, what Bill is talking about is so appealing in the sense of asking the question of, could we do less? Could we actually live better with less? And part of me thinks that that's something really to aspire to. And yet, when I actually think about the world energy systems, think about the systems that we've grown accustomed to, and it's not just grown accustomed to, in fact, have greatly improved the quality of our life in many ways. Not always. As Bill said, there's some things that I think in many ways less is more, but there's no question that you would rather be living here in Cambridge, Massachusetts today than living in Ghana right now, as an average person in Ghana. There is no question about it. In terms of infant mortality, in terms of adult mortality, in terms of health care, in terms of all sorts of things that we take for granted here. And I'm worried about the tough choices that lie ahead. And what I'm curious about getting into with Bill over the next, I don't know how long we have, half hour, 45 minutes, is the question of how do we deal with those tough choices, and more importantly, our social movements. And we need a social movement. I completely agree with Bill that we need a social movement. I'm not sure a social movement will be sufficient, but I suspect it will be necessary as a component of change. But the question is, how do social movements deal with hard choices? My concern is that many of the social movements that I've read about and studied over the years really had relatively simple ideas, relatively simple principles that they could apply. And unfortunately, for climate change, we're up for some very hard choices. Bill mentioned the wonderful distribution of the virtues of distributed energy, in particular, for example, the photovoltaics on his home. Those are very expensive, and you're fortunate to be able to afford them. I can tell you that most people in this country couldn't afford them, and that would be a very difficult thing to do. Moreover, there are hard choices, even with renewable energy. Let me give you an example. Wind energy, for example, the density at which you can extract energy from the wind when you average out the spacing of windmills is something like 1 watt per square meter. Something like that, about 1 watt per square meter. In Wyoming, where they mine coal, just to give you a comparison, the density in a square meter of land is something like 1 million times that, if you actually assume that you're going to use that over 100 years. Now, a coal mine is nothing pretty to look at, but it's very, very dense. Therefore, it's in one place. That's not to say that there are horrible, horrible effects of burning coal the way we do it today, but you have to realize what we're talking about is building not just a few windmills. We're talking about a lot of windmills. Already, Cape Wind is being opposed here. My friend who wants to build a solar thermal plant in the Mojave Desert has environmental groups completely in opposition because of concern over endangered species. And I actually suspect we're up for some very, very hard choices. And the questions of how we navigate those choices are not at all trivial. Environmental groups in the U.S., and even around the world, but especially in the U.S., over the last 40 years even, have really been built to oppose development. I think part of this is grounded, and many people here have studied this. Larry Buell and Bill are both very thoughtful about these issues. But I think some of it has to do with the pastoralism, the idea of wilderness and protection of wilderness, conservation movement, that essentially environmental groups have lobbied against building new stuff. Let's do less. That's kind of the spirit of what Bill was talking about. Let's make do with less. Fixing climate change, I would put forward, is in fact going to be the biggest build in the last 50 years. It's going to make the highway system seem trivial. It's about replacing the infrastructure that has driven the Industrial Revolution around the world over the last 150 years. It's about completely replacing it. The good news is it's not that expensive. It's something like 1% of GDP. To give you the perspective for the U.S., that's a couple $100 million a year or something like that. It's a lot, like a couple $100 billion a year. It's a lot of money, but it's not that much money compared to things like Iraq, right? No, a couple $100 billion is affordable. It's just a lot, right? We're willing to spend $20 billion a year. We're not ready to spend $200. But if we spent $200 billion for 30 years, we could fix the problem. But it's about building. It's about construction. It's about steel in the ground and concrete and massive building projects, every single one of which there are people who don't want it there. This is really becoming bigger and bigger issue. And there are real tough choices to be made, because wilderness is important too. Right? I don't think you want windmills throughout the Adirondacks, Bill, and nor do I. And this is going to be a tough choice. Where do we decide? Is it Nantucket Sound that we don't want windmills? Where do we actually say it's okay? I don't have an answer for this. I just know that these are choices that we haven't really grappled with yet, and they're going to be very hard choices going forward. And I guess what I'm curious about, because we need a social movement to get going, the question is, this is a social movement like none I've ever seen that has to actually step forward and make some really difficult decisions and support making trade-offs. And it's hard to unify people when they disagree about those trade-offs. So I want to stop there and really open it up to Don first, and then to other people in the audience who are very thoughtful about these issues, some of these people. But I think I'd really like to hear from Bill as well about how to navigate some of those hard choices. Thanks very much.